Welcome into another edition of the Front Office. I'm Tony Lombardi, joined by Brian McFarland, and in a moment we'll be joined by our special guest, Jeff Zrebiec from The Athletic. Brian, how are you, my friend?
Good, Tony. How things going?
Good. Things are good. Things are good. Hey, before we bring in Jeff, the Ravens have just adjusted the contract of Michael Pierce, enabling them to treat his retirement as a post-June 1 move. Talk about the thought process there and how that benefits the Ravens and their cap.
Sure. Well, I mean, there are two parts of that really. One, he was due a $2 million bonus last Sunday, so a week from yesterday. So obviously, if he's retiring, they're not going to pay that. So they have the option, or he has the option of filing his retirement papers now or before that bonus is due, or and I which this move seems to indicate the Ravens would rather handle that retirement after June 1st, so they spread the money out between this year and next year. Um, but you can't do that with that bonus hanging there. So they redid the deal to remove the bonus, and then remove. He had a workout bonus in there as well, and obviously he's not going to be working out. So 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 they had to redo that to effectuate the ability to do it after June 1st. So, but it's not like a release with a retirement. You can't process a retirement with one of those two post June 1 designations. Um, so what they did is they basically redid the deal, took all that kind of stuff out, so he's basically, his deal just sits there now with a minimum base salary till June 1st, and then he'll submit his retirement papers, and they'll put him on the reserve retired list, and that will remove him from the roster at that point. There only would have been about $667,000 in cap savings if they did it now. There's pretty much close to 2 million, or just over 2 million in total if they do it after June 1st. So by taking the bonuses out, they saved about 745,000 now, and they'll get the other 1.255 mil in June.
Are there any other transactions since our last podcast that impact the overall cap?
Well, I mean, we know the numbers on Cooper Rush's deal, and Jeff reported those numbers basically, but it's I mean, half of it is incentives. There's 3 million each year in incentives. This year's cap number is only at 1.9 mil. They did use 3 extra void years. Next year's cap number is about 3 million. And then there'll be like 1.6, I think it was, in 2027 for dead money if he's not extended before then. But that would be dead money on the cap due to the void years.
So knowing what we know now about those two deals, Pierce and Rush, where does that leave the Ravens' effective cap space?
So they have, in cap space itself, they have about 11 million in effective cap space. That still leaves them about 3 million short once you factor in the money they'll get from Pierce and the money they'll get from Marcus Williams, which was 2.1 million, Pierce 1.255. So factoring that in, they're still in the hole a little bit, but much better off than they were a while ago. And obviously, it'll depend on what other moves they make. Restructures for Roquan Smith is a possibility. Matabike is a possibility, and more. Hopefully, instead, an extension for either Lamar, well, for hopefully both, but Lamar and Derrick Henry. They haven't touched Lamar's deal, which tells me they want an extension, obviously, and they're going to hold out to restructure until either they can't get an extension, or maybe they won't restructure him at all.
With that effective cap space being still a little bit in the red, even with Rush, Pierce, and Marcus Williams, what is, do you think that the Ravens could still begin the season and make adjustments in season if they needed to get some extra money?
Yeah, they could, because part of that effective cap space number is an amount to carry into the season. I always use 6 million a year for that. Last year they didn't need the whole 6 million. 2 years ago, when they had all those injuries, they needed more than the 6 million. So Lamar's deal would be one where they could carry it into the year without restructuring if they can't get an extension. And then during the season or trade deadline, they could restructure it. Then you're not going to get the full cap savings at the trade deadline, but because it's such a high number anyway, halfway into the season you could get 7 to 8 million still. And so if there was a trade piece then that they wanted to acquire, they would have that flexibility, and then you're not restructuring the whole salary for this year. You're really just doing half of it at that point.
All right. Well, thanks for that update. And joining us now, a friend to the program, and in my opinion, the best reporter on the Ravens beat from The Athletic, New Jersey native and fellow Loyola Greyhound, Jeff Zrebiec. Jeff, welcome into the front office. How are you?
Good, guys. Always happy to join you.
Well, thanks for being here. Hey, before we get to the Ravens, Jeff, there haven't been many upsets. So how is your NCAA bracket holding up, and how do you like the Terps' chances against Florida, currently listed as 6.5-point underdogs?
I'll be honest with you, Tony. I haven't filled out a bracket in 4 or 5 years. I just kind of ever since having kids, I tried to eliminate some other things that frustrate me and take my time and often lead to frustration. So I've kind of stayed away from the brackets. I have watched a good bit of the tournament. I used to cover Maryland for 1 year, so back in the day, one of the Gary Williams years. So the game was thrilling yesterday, and my 6-year-old has gotten into it a little bit. And last night when Derek Queen hit that shot, I was sitting downstairs by myself. I didn't want to scream and wake up the 2 kids, but I wanted to share it with someone. It was cool. It was like a cool moment. So I went running up, just hoping my oldest would still be awake and I could show it to him on my phone. But no, he was sleeping, and I had to wait till this morning. First thing he asked me when he got up though was if the Terps won, and I thought that was kind of cool. It's just I'm not. I kind of want to say, I root for the area and I root for good things for the state and the area. So sure, I'm rooting for University of Maryland, and I like to see them do well in the sports, along with I'd like to see the all the local schools do well. Florida looks like a little bit of a different animal right now. Maryland, obviously Grand Canyon was so overmatched, but I don't think Maryland played very well against Colorado State, and they're going to need to play. I don't want to say the perfect game. I mean, we're talking about a very good Maryland team here. This isn't, I don't think it would be a monumental upset, but they're going to have to play a heck of a lot better and avoid the lapses and missing free throws and getting, there's no reason they don't rebound better than they do. So they're going to have to do everything right to beat Florida, but I just think it's great that they're in this position. I think University of Maryland needed a little bit of run given everything else that's going on, and it's been kind of exciting to follow the last couple days.
It has been fun. So hopefully they'll continue the ride, but so far it's been good. I tell you what, I'm showing my age here, but I want to call walking or traveling all the time when I'm watching these kids play. It's not what it used to be, traveling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I saw that on Twitter, everyone talking about it, but I didn't watch that play and think, "Wow, that was a travel." Just because I think you're so used to seeing, you see multiple plays a game that you say, "Well, he traveled," and it never gets called. So the basketball has clearly changed in that way.
Yeah, I've given up on calling traveling. It's just not there anymore. So anyway, let's get back to the Ravens and the NFL. And it's tough really to assess the offseason so far for Eric DeCosta, since we're still a month away from the NFL draft. But that said, has anything they have done or haven't done surprised you so far, Jeff?
I don't think I'll say this, and I don't want to, this isn't a criticism of Eric or the Ravens. I think it's what they haven't done that has surprised me a little. Like now, Obviously, I wasn't surprised by Pierce stepping away. That seemed like it was heading that direction, even in locker clean out. And I had heard in Indy at the combine that they were going to be in the backup quarterback market. So Cooper Rush didn't surprise me. You look at Hopkins's price, and it was sort of a no-brainer. I had a pretty good sense they were going to re-sign Stanley. So none of their moves have really surprised me. But it's sort of what they haven't done that. There's just so many big moves still out there regarding key players for them that haven't been addressed. And I'd kind of thought that they would make one significant salary cap cutting move, to open up some flexibility for them before free agency. And like whether that was a Lamar Jackson extension, whether that was a Derrick Henry extension, whether they traded or released Mark Andrews. The Justin Tucker situation still out there. So none of that stuff has kind of been resolved in any way. I know Linderbaum and Hamilton wouldn't be moves to help this year's cap, but again, there's 8 to 10 guys, key players on this team that you've sort of felt like they'd have their contracts addressed, or at least, they would talk about it this offseason. And none of those moves have been made yet. And yet here we are, almost into the third week already here after the new league year. And that is a little surprising to me. I thought we'd see a couple things. Obviously, the max restructure of Marlon Humphrey got him the money they need to get to this point. But that they haven't done some of those other moves, like addressed Lamar's contract or extended Henry or done something with Andrews. I think I've been a little surprised we haven't seen one of those dominoes fall.
You mentioned Justin Tucker, so I want to get the elephant out of the room right out of the gate. Let's talk about that. What do you think? And I'm not going to hold you to it by any stretch of the imagination, but how do you think this ends for Justin Tucker in Baltimore, or does it end?
I don't think it's a sure thing that it ends. Obviously everyone here, and I mean everyone, that's the, attorney of the accusers, and that's the Ravens, and that's Tucker and his legal team and all that. I think, everyone's sort of been in a standstill here as we wait for the NFL investigation and the NFL to release its findings and any potential discipline. So that's kind of the where we're at right now. But I keep coming back to this, Tony. And even if Tucker avoids discipline here, I don't want to handicap how likely it is that that happens, because that'd be speculation on my part. Obviously, there's a lot of accusers out there, but there's other factors that have also been well documented, that these were from, 10, 12 years ago, or in some cases, and there really hasn't been any documentation that we've seen on it. So I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but I keep coming back to this. You have a 35-year-old kicker who makes a lot of money, coming off his worst year in the NFL. Um, you know, Probably in decline. I'm not ready to say he couldn't still be a very good kicker. I think we saw him finish strong. But yes, I think based on what we saw last year, you'd have to say he's in decline. And he's had this off season where he's basically fighting for his career and to save his reputation. So say he gets either a very short disciplinary, suspension, or doesn't get anything. Um, are you confident in him that this isn't going to follow him all season? That he's going to be. I mean, kicker is such a mental game. Or can you be confident, if you're the Ravens, that his head's going to be in the right place all year after dealing with this all off season, and he's not going to allow the questions to bother him, and his teammates getting the questions about him, and the big press conference he's probably going to have if he's still on the team come training camp? Like, where is his head going to be at? What do you trust him at this point? How is he doing this off season? Is he ready to kick again, or is he so busy fighting this and dealing with the allegations and everything that's entailed? So That's why I kind of suggest that I think they probably if I was to guess, I'd say they move on regardless of what happens here in terms of the investigation. I think they're, waiting on that like everyone, and that could have a say in it. But I think you still get back to the fact that you got a 35-year-old kicker who makes a lot of money, who's coming off a very bad year, who's going to have a lot of pressure on him, a lot of fingers being pointed at him and fans jeering him. Maybe not Ravens fans, but visiting fans. He's gonna be so under the microscope. And do you want that guy being your kicker, knowing that that's all ahead of him? So that's why I think again, it could become a football decision, even though if it doesn't look like that's the case right now.
I agree with everything you said. And Brian, with that in mind, if it does follow that path, what are, just for the edification of our listeners, what are the Ravens' options from a cap perspective there?
Yeah, well, and I think that just making a lot of good points there. One thing with the way they have handled Pierce's deal is they do still have that one um, uh, uh, pre June 1, post June 1 designation. That they have that one since they didn't use it on Pierce. They still have that in their back pocket if something worse, and I shouldn't say worse, but more bad news, so to speak, comes out, bad press, whatever you want to call it. So they do still have that. But as Jeff was talking through that, I guess they are waiting for the league, and maybe that gives them some kind of cover. I don't know. I'm not sure. I totally understand their thought process, but if Jeff is correct that at some point they're going to move on to him, they're going to have to do it before the season starts anyway, because he's got a $4.2 million salary, and once now he could be suspended so they can get some money back, but the rest is guaranteed. At that point once the season starts. So if he does, as Jeff, the concerns Jeff is saying about will he be able to handle the pressure, coming off of a bad year, fans of the other teams, and if he kicks poorly, then you're stuck with. I mean, if he gets suspended for a couple games, the bulk of that 4.2 is still there that you're going to end up still paying him. Because it's not guaranteed. I mean, it's not technically guaranteed, but once the season starts, it is, and you can't void it. That's not the kind of guarantee you can void under because of a suspension. So that I if he's on the team week one, or even suspended week one, but technically on the team, I think they're stuck with him. I mean, they're saying that he's our guy, and we're going to stick by him because you could get out from under that 4.2 at any point before then. And that 4.2 is not insubstantial.
No, particularly for a team that's tight against the cap as it is.
And Tony, the other thing I would say here, and Justin Tucker is going to cast a huge shadow. So say you draft a kicker and they have all these day 3 picks, and there's quite a few draftable kickers here. You bring him in and Tucker's still in the building, you're setting that kid up to fail, right? I mean, you can always sign one of these journeyman veterans. They're out there. They're going to be out there all year. I don't know how much confidence you'd have in that option, but I think if you kind of think you're probably going to move on, or you're going to have to move on sooner rather than later, I think the draft is probably the best way you go about finding your kicker. You trust Randy Brown and the staff that they have and how they develop, kickers. Then I just don't know how you could keep him around if you have a draft pick kicker. How that kicker or how that rookie kicker is not going to be looking over his shoulder and facing questions about competing with Justin Tucker. So I think there does come a point, if you've decided you're most likely going to have to move on, even for football reasons, you have to make the move. I mean, maybe they draft a kicker and then the next day they make the announcement, or they may wait a week or whatever. I don't know. I don't think it's impossible that they keep him either. I could, they're very loyal to people that mean a lot to the organization. And Tucker is, a Ring of Honor guy who has a very close relationship with the team's decision makers. But if they in their head basically think they're probably going to have to move on, and they want to draft a kicker, and I've heard that plenty that there's a very good chance they select a kicker, then I think you have to do it shortly after the draft to give your rookie kicker a chance to succeed.
Jeff, you and I were talking off the air about how things are not moving very quickly right now with the NFL, particularly the Ravens. And last week, Brian and I were talking about how seems to be a huge number of big name free agents still available. And I'm just wondering if the dynamics of the league have changed in terms of how teams are approaching certain veterans, that if they wait around a little while, they can get them on the cheap. And maybe there's a sense of desperation from some of these players that they come in at better numbers that fit more comfortably into team salary caps. Are you observing the same sort of thing? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably some of that. I think there's also, you know, this wasn't a very good free agent class. I mean, this free agent class was pretty much panned. Not that didn't mean teams weren't going to spend money, but I think you had fewer teams who were willing to kind of wade in the deep end of free agency this year. So that probably affected certain guys. And I think there's other teams that also have kind of, I don't want to say follow the Ravens because they're not the only team that makes these decisions, but I think there's other teams that have kind of shifted to the, not doing, not wanting to do free agency or not wanting to be as active, feeling like it doesn't suit them very well, and it's not been a very good recipe for some teams. So I think there's all it, and now I think, it's been more quiet than I thought, these last 10 days, but I think you're in the if you're a veteran now, I think, you're probably saying to yourself, look, I'm not getting offered very much now. I might as well hold out. Like these low deals are going to be available after the draft or in July and August during training camp. So why should I rush? Why not wait to see what happens a little bit over the next month or so? Because what I'm getting offered now is going to still be there in the end. But yeah, I mean, you look at the free agent market, Tony, and I mean, there's some good players. I mean, I think I looked it up the other day, and I think there was about 33 of the Athletics top 150 free agents are still available. I saw Pro Football Talk right. I think it was 17 of their top 100. So, and a lot of former Ravens, when you look at guys like Dobbins and Zadarius Smith and Matthew Judon, Marcus Williams, obviously still out there, although it sounded like he was on a visit to Carolina or something today. But there's a lot of guys still available, and there are going to be bargains to be had. And I do think you'll get kind of a push closer to the draft when guys want to find a home before these teams bring in all these, start filling up their roster space with rookies and undrafted free agents.
In 2022, the Ravens had two first-round draft picks. They really nailed both of them, and Kyle Hamilton and Tyler Linderbaum. Now, Kyle Hamilton, if he isn't extended anytime soon, he'll certainly get his fifth-year option, which I believe Brian is due in May, that decision?
Yeah, the Monday after the draft.
Okay. So are you convinced, Jeff, that Tyler Linderbaum will receive the same, that fifth-year option?
No, I'm not. And I mistakenly, I think very early this offseason, I kind of called it a no-brainer without doing my homework on it. I don't, I don't know. The way I look at it, and Brian is all over this stuff better than anybody. The way I look at it is, you look at the franchise number for him, right? And the franchise number would be pretty close to the fifth-year option number, if I'm not, is that correct, Brian?
Yeah, because it depends on what happens with the cap, but the fifth-year option number is the franchise tag for this year, and then and next year's will go up a little probably
Yeah.
because the salaries go up, but it's not going to be it's not going to go up by 5 or 6 million. It might go up by 1.5 million or 2. So yeah, I mean and it's not the fifth-year option would be guaranteed soon as it's signed. So
Yeah.
that makes him harder to move if you wanted to trade him, those kinds of things. So I think there's something to be said for that, why not just play it out? And you're not limiting your options potentially, especially if he gets hurt or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw the guy. We saw him have neck issues this past year, which are always scary for offensive linemen. He missed some time with a neck injury, so I think you almost look at it as, you know, maybe you decline it and you wait another year and you get that flexibility and you just commit to using the franchise tag the following offseason on them, which wouldn't cost that much more than just picking, putting on the 5th-year option, which immediately becomes guaranteed. So, I think they would like to re-sign him. I could see it happening, but I no longer feel like that's a no-brainer decision. In fact, I think if I was handicapping it, I'd probably say it's more likely they decline it than pick that up.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I think that that's a really good point that you guys are making. So that if it does come, May comes around and comes and goes, and they have not extended that 5th-year option, fans may lose their minds because they're not diving into
Yeah.
it quickly enough, to see what the financial ramifications are.
Yeah, and it's absolutely, and I was the same way, Tony. I was ignorant to it. I hadn't thought about it until I was at the combine actually, and someone ran by me, why, and I was talking to an agent. He ran by me why he wouldn't characterize that as a no-brainer necessarily, especially with the 2 Pro Bowls and what that did to his, salary going up. So, that's why we have people around to cover this team, right? You can explain this kind of stuff, but I do think if it came out that they declined it, then people would really be scratching their heads. But it does make sense from a financial standpoint.
I have a question for you about a Lamar extension or a restructure. But before I ask that question, I want to have Brian chime in real quickly about the differences between those two, Brian, and why an extension is preferred over the restructure.
Yeah, well, the restructure, I mean, both of them are going to be lowering his cap number this year and spreading that out into the future. And you would probably get less savings because of the size of the signing bonus he would get. If it's an extension, it would probably be less than the restructure. But the big difference is not really about this year. It's about the next 2 years, 26 and 27, which are technically the last 2 years of his deal. And there is, if all the reports are correct, there is a no franchise tag provision for 28. So that's looming there as well. So an extension it will smooth out some of the numbers next year without a restructure. His cap number will be 75 million, same in 27. You'd like to see those lower. Those are definitely put in there to almost force something to happen. So that's the concern there. If you restructure, you're adding about 5 million onto each of those, so you're looking at 80. He only has about 12.5 million in dead money in 28 from void years. But if you restructure, you're adding about 15 million to that number. So by getting an extension done, you'll lower this year's cap number. Again, not maybe as much as you would with a restructure, but you're going to take those 275 millions down into the 40s, maybe, so the cap may only go up by 30 million next year, and that pretty much Lamar's contract eats all of that up if nothing happens. So that's why it definitely an extension makes more sense. But as we saw last time, it wasn't easy to get to. I would think it's easier this time because the parameters are a little more defined between Allen's contract and Dak Prescott's contract, and then obviously the idea of fully guaranteed money would seemingly be off the table for now. But but it still takes 2 to tango.
Yeah, I would think, and this is going to be my question for Jeff, that with Allen's extension, that they may have given the Ravens a blueprint. Obviously the things that agents, well, not in this case an agent, but the succeeding contracts always seem to take the preceding contract and up the ante just a tad because they came in later. and I thought that Allen's contract would give Lamar's camp the blueprint to get that extension done. But Jeff, it's not always that easy with Lamar's camp.
Exactly. That's the, you know, technically, and Brian, brought out the reasons too why it should be much easier than it was last time. Um, but nothing's ever easy in these high stakes negotiations, and when you're dealing directly with Lamar, that adds a different challenge and a different wrinkle to it. Like, you know, you ask yourself, well, just go up a little on Allen's deal and say, here you go, Lamar, you're the highest paid quarterback in football, and let's roll. This helps. But it's not that simple. It just never is. Like I can't speak to whether that would be good enough for Lamar. I'm certain the Ravens know that they're probably going to have to make him the highest paid guy again. And by getting it done this offseason, it would take a lot of pressure off going forward. But and I think we've heard already from people. Like I think um what is it, Joel Corey was on the was talking with Glenn Clark on his show, and he basically said flat out, like, if you're Lamar, like, you wouldn't do that. You'd have so much more leverage next off season because they'd have to adjust those numbers, that it would just be untenable to have the cap numbers like they are for next year and then the following year. So the Ravens would have to do something. But is that something that appeals to Lamar, having that leverage? And it certainly would make things more difficult on the Ravens. You just don't really know. Like with all things with Lamar, that there's a bit of a mystery to it, and how he perceives it. But man, I'm sure it would go a long way if they were be able to get that deal done this offseason, not just for the flexibility they'd get, but how you check off a major thing off your to-do list the next offseason, and you probably would get ahead of some more quarterback deals that are coming down the pike because they're just going to keep going up and up.
Yeah, and you look at it from the perspective of everything's about comparison, particularly with quarterbacks. And you always look back to Mahomes, and Mahomes doesn't operate the same way as these other guys. He operates, it's almost like the Brady approach. We'll do more cap friendly deals so we can have a better team and compete for a title. At least that's perception. You guys both get that sort of perception from the way Mahomes and his camp behaves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, that first contract he signed now, I mean, it's been revised, but it's still not pushing to the top like these other deals are. I mean, and Allen's deal is a little different because they basically ripped up the prior deal and started over. So I mean, and I've been meaning to look at these numbers to see what he was due under the old deal. And then if he had gone to, because he only quote unquote got 55 million a year, but that's full 55 million. When you hear, and then Lamar's was a full 53 million because he was coming off the franchise tag. But when guys extend, they're extending based on the old numbers, and then when we hear 60 million, for instance, that is the new year. So if it's 3 or new years, it's 60 million a year. But the old deal was 42 a year. So Allen, and that's why I guess part of the reason they ripped it up. So it is funny because at first I heard 55 million a year, highest paid. I'm like, what are they talking about? Until I realized it was a fully torn up deal and start over. Although I think he was being a little disingenuous when he was saying about he wasn't going to take 60 million and take money away from others on the team, because I don't think he would have hit that new deal if they just added years at 60 million, would not have averaged 60 million. I'm not even sure what averaged 55.
Another one of the topics I wanted to get to is the return of the prodigal son. Prodigal son being Ben Cleveland. Now, it's generally believed by fans that Cleveland was in the doghouse for a couple of reasons. At first, Jeff, do you believe the doghouse exists? And then secondly, your thoughts on his return?
Yeah, I'm sure. I know that's a hot button issue for Harbaugh. Like anytime it's come up, that's something he takes personally, does not like to hear. And you'd get a sternly worded rebuke if you if you bring it up to him while you're talking. But again, I think it's natural to be down on certain players, but the one thing I will say about the doghouse is nobody had more at stake with Ben Cleveland succeeding than John Harbaugh. Like, it's on the record. It's been said in press conferences that he stood on the table in the draft room to draft Ben Cleveland. And he even wanted Eric to trade up either to earlier in the third round or late in the second. I forgot at the time to grab Ben Cleveland. So it does not make John Harbaugh look good to bury him. He, of all peoples, one should want him to succeed, should want him to prove that he was worthy of that pick. So that's what I would say in response to the doghouse thing with John. I do think that Ben Cleveland just never garnered the confidence of the coaching staff. Part of it was health, part of it was maybe didn't practice as hard as they would have liked, and a couple things. But here you got, Tony, a guy that you have no guarantees. You're basically getting a guy as a reserve offensive lineman for basically the league minimum with no guarantees and bonuses and any of that. And regardless of what you think of Ben Cleveland, obviously he has a legal issue he has to figure out too. But regardless what you think, I think if Ben Cleveland's your ninth offensive lineman or your 10th offensive lineman and your backup guard, I think you sleep okay at night. And to get him for that number, when you look at some of the other salaries, I mean, look, what's his face? Josh Jones just got 4 million from the Seattle Seahawks. And what was he, the Ravens' sixth or seventh offensive lineman last year? To get Ben Cleveland as a third of that or whatever, I don't think I understand the deal. I mean, I know people look at it from a morality perspective and talk about his arrest this offseason and the no tolerance policy or whatever you want to talk about. But I mean, from a football standpoint, I think it makes sense to sign that kind of deal with him, given what you're paying. And you got at the very least, you got a ninth or 10th offensive lineman who's played a little, has starting experience, who knows the system, and you feel okay about in that role.
Odafe Oweh's contract situation is a little murky. His cap number under the fifth-year option is 13.25 million, I believe. The Ravens would probably like to bring that number down via an extension. And I'll ask the same question to both of you guys. And Brian, you can go first. How big of a challenge do you think that will be?
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously put some things out on social media that are, to be determined what they actually mean, if they mean anything, if they're about contract or not. I mean, yeah, I mean, they have to decide, is he, do they, I mean, he did improve this past year, but is he worth, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 million a year? Which is probably where he would fall in at this time. Maybe he's a guy that, if that's what they're offering, and maybe if there is something to be read in those reactions that, maybe they offered him, 12 or 13, and he's like, no, I'm betting on myself. If I put up another double digit sack year next year, then I'm going to, I'll cash in at the 20 million a year or maybe more at that point. So I don't know what the free agent edge market looks like next year, but I mean, that is something they have to factor in too, because we already talked about Linderbaum and the franchise tag. So, they got to focus on those things as well. Of, we can't really have two big name guys coming up on, that we might need to tag, because we can only use it on one of them. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, he might, whether that social media stuff is because of that or something else. He seems like a guy I mean, obviously Edge has been a problem over the last few years. And while he's not a superstar, he still is a guy that, performed well, and that he's a kind of guy they like, in that he does well against the run as well. So he's not just a pure pass rusher. We saw, when Judon left, he went from 8, 9 sack guy to a 12 for a 13, 14 sack guy. Same thing with Zadarius Smith. So you have to think about those guys. I mean, you would prefer those guys back, but it also may be just the way they use them too.
Yeah, I honestly, guys, I think I think the Oweh is the hardest decision they have to make this offseason in a lot of ways. I mean, extending Lamar is a no-brainer, obviously. And Henry, it's always difficult to pay older running backs, but I think this guy has proven to be a perfect fit and is an absolute freak. And you don't really look at the age as much with him as you do other guys. To me, that's a no-brainer. He wants to be here. You can look at some of the other guys. But with Oweh, I think the question is, how good do you think he really is? Like, do you view him as a bookend edge rusher for you going forward? I mean, do you think this is kind of who he is? Who's a a quality run defender and has 8 to 10 sack kind of ceiling here. But it'll always kind of never be one of those like high impact guys that keeps offensive coordinators and offensive tackles up at night. I think it all going to depend on their evaluation of him and what he still can be as a player. I mean, look, this guy had 10 sacks this past year, and people gloss over it like he's a scrub. I think it's gone the other way on Odafe Oweh a little bit here. He's a good player. He's not Nick Bosa or Myles Garrett, and that's okay. I mean, there's only so many of those edge rushers out there, but I mean, this is a guy who had double-digit sacks in the NFL. I mean, let's not gloss over what he is as a player. He's a solid guy. He's a good guy. I think he's a guy that every team would want and could utilize in a good way. It's just like, what are you paying him as? Like in this pass rusher market, with how high the numbers are getting on edge rushers and how everybody's looking for that elite piece. I mean, I imagine he's asking for a lot of money, and I could understand if the Ravens don't want to give it. But man, if he goes out and has a dozen sacks this coming year, and he had 10 last year, and I think you could say that you could clearly see there's room for improvement. If he takes another step forward into that 12 or 13 sack guy, you're basically losing him next offseason, or you're going to have to write him a blank check to keep him. And so that's what I mean. I think that's a very difficult decision they have to make this offseason on Odafe Oweh. You're not going to get any huge discounts on him, nor should you, given his age and the year he's coming off of. So I think you really got to feel confident in what your evaluation is as a player and his upside. Because if you think there's a decent chance he's going to keep getting better and he could become a 12 to 15 sack guy, man, I think you got to find a way to pay him. I don't know for a fact that's how they feel about him, though. Therein is the challenge in what you want to do with him this offseason.
Yeah, and if you take that cryptic tweet that he put out there, and most people I think interpreted it as, yeah, we're not getting anything done anytime soon.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then it sounds like his camp believes that the Ravens lowballed them, and who's to say how that thing's going to go? But it would be different if the Ravens had some youthful leverage. And what I mean by that is like if Adisa Isaac was doing anything and David
Yeah.
Gabo, but neither one of those guys can stay healthy.
No, I mean you got all these guys. It's kind of like the tight end position. Van Noy's on his last year of his deal. We'll see what happens to his contract this offseason. I mean, given what the bargain he is, man, I mean, who knows if he's going to say, you know what, I'm not playing for this. I'll retire or whatever. I haven't heard that, but you just never know. I mean, he's a proud guy who's on a very team friendly deal, and Jabo is in the last year of his deal. And I think if you're doing a roster analysis right now, you'd have to say he's going to be on the bubble come July and August, and then Oweh will be on playing out the 5th-year option on his deal. So you just don't know. I mean, I think Tavius Robinson's a solid rotational guy, but I don't think you're going to pencil him in as a starter who you expect to get double-digit sacks. So, and that's a position they haven't really spent big money on. They've chosen to go the veteran on the cheap route and then try to get theirs in the draft. So, if you drafted a guy that you think is going to be a perennial double-digit sack guy, I think you got to spend the money to keep him. I just don't. As I said before, I'm not confident about their evaluation on him. I just don't know how they feel, his upside is and his ceiling is. I mean, they could feel as strongly as they've ever felt about him and be willing to pay it. But man, that's going to be a heavy tab to kind of take if you're unsure about his ceiling.
Jeff, the Ravens lost Brandon Stevens in free agency. They decided to part ways with Arthur Millette. They decide to part ways with Marcus Williams. And our Darius Washington is a situation that still has to be monitored because we don't know how that's going to play out. This is a team or franchise that often talks about depth and quality in their secondary, and they're losing bodies. Any surprise that they haven't done anything there?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, but I still think they will. Um, we're getting to the point where, you're closing in on those post comp pick deals. Brian, what's the date again for that they no longer count against the comp pick formula?
Yeah, that's all. That's also the Monday after the draft.
Yeah,
So
so we're not that far. We're only about a month out of that. So I think, we all know how creative they are and telling people, you know what, we're not interested now. We don't want to lose one of those two fifth-round comps or fourth round possibly comp. For what would be for Stevens or McCary, but we're still going to do some. But yeah, I mean, like a guy like Julian Blackman, who I guess is in Carolina today, so he could become a moot point. There's a guy that, Chuck Pagano from living in Indianapolis, being their coach. He obviously seen him a good bit. He makes sense to me as the type of Ravens player. He's out there coming off injury, so he'd probably be cheap. I mean, there's guys out there. We're signing Trey Davies White as an option. I'd have to think at some point we will see them sign two or three veteran defensive backs. But I do think that's obviously going to be a story early in the draft on day one or day two, because, I mean, it's not that you're looking at it and they have four cornerbacks you feel good about. They only have four cornerbacks, period. I mean, you have Marlon Humphrey, Nate Wiggins, Jalen Armour Davis, and TJ Tampa, and it's just like, okay, and that's it. I mean, and we know you're gonna have, you know, 9 or 10 of those guys in training camp, even more possibly. So yeah, they got some work to do on that depth chart. It's a little surprising they haven't added a veteran, but closer we get to that Monday after the draft deadline, where they don't signings don't count anymore against comp picks. I think you'll see them maybe bring in a couple guys and start lining up some deals. But that's clearly, you look at that and you have to say that's their biggest need, just the secondary overall.
Jeff, you mentioned Chuck Pagano. He's a ball coach, and that coaching energy just runs through a coach's veins. And he returns to Baltimore and John Harbaugh. Comfort zones really for Chuck. He's been a coordinator, a head coach, a DB coach. Now he's back to manage the Ravens secondary. How big of a get was that for John Harbaugh?
Yeah, I think it was really important. Just we kind of saw, they spent way too many assets in terms of salary cap space and draft picks on that secondary to have it be 32nd ranked pass defense in the league for a good chunk of last year. And they so clearly missed Denard Wilson, who was instrumental. So many of those guys had, whether it's Darby or Brandon Stevens, and there were others in that group, obviously had the kind of the best years of their career under Arthur Millette, under Denard Wilson. I don't think that was an accident. So to get in another veteran, well-respected coach who can also be a sounding board, has been in that head head chair there where he's made decisions as a head coach, and they get a veteran presence on that staff, someone who also can help Zach Orr, who's still a very young defensive coordinator. I think that's huge. I mean, I think, all of us have seen Chuck in action. We've been around him. Charismatic guy that everybody likes and knows how to motivate players. I mean, a guy that people like Ed Reed vouch for. I think that speaks for itself. I said all last offseason, I think the biggest loss was the veteran coaches and some of the guys that had a lot of respect from the players, whether it was Weaver, Denard Wilson, obviously Mike McDonald. And I think you bring somebody else in the building who kind of replaces some of what they lost the previous year.
Great points. Yeah, I agree. The AFC North rivals, if you look at what the Ravens haven't done, and I know Ravens fans get a little anxious that they haven't improved the team to the point that they wanted to, but the first thing that each one of these teams does each year, how as they assess their chances of winning their division. And when you look around the AFC North, and Jeff, I know you have colleagues with the Athletic, it looks to me like Pittsburgh doesn't look like the Steelers of the past. They're still looking for a quarterback, and they're spending money on wide receivers without a quarterback, which kind of takes away some of their leverage. Secondly, you've got the Cincinnati Bengals, which on the roster, they've gotten weaker, yet they've spent a lot more money. And you've got the Cleveland Browns, who are the Cleveland Browns. Myles Garrett didn't want to be there all off season. Suddenly, when they came up with ridiculous money, he's changed his mind. He thinks that the Cleveland Browns can win a Super Bowl. So both of you, if I could ask you, what is your assessment of the AFC North and how the Ravens stack up against those three teams?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I think yeah, right now, on paper, certainly the Ravens might be by far. I mean, Cincinnati, obviously, their offense is amazing, and they're spending money there, but they haven't done anything to that defense. And we saw what happened last year. The Ravens won barn burners against them, but that's because we outscored them, and there's nothing that seems to be that they've done anything with the defense. So they're going to have to draft really well with those two contracts in place for the wide receivers. So, but I mean, I think they're probably the second because the Steelers just don't have a quarterback, and I don't know. Obviously, Russell Wilson wasn't the answer last year, and I don't know that Aaron Rodgers is going to be that much different. In fact, Aaron Rodgers with the Jets wasn't throwing the ball down the field at all. At least Wilson was throwing, pop-ups to the guys, the Jeff Blake kind of bombs to the big receiver, and they have two of them now. Their defense should still be solid, but until they get that figured out, and then obviously the Browns are the Browns. I don't know that Russell is still a good defense, but I don't know that Russell Wilson makes them any better than they were for much of last year, really. So, I mean, yeah, I think the Ravens are definitely, at least on paper, the class of the division.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I mean, maybe I give the Steelers too much respect, but you still have a team that has a lot of individual talent and is well coached and has a good culture. So I think they're going to be there, but the question is, how legitimate are they? Are they legitimate contenders? And until they get the quarterback figured out, it's hard to say they are. But you also you consistently see them every year kind of punch above their weight, give the Ravens problems, and kind of be there at the end where they enter, the last couple of weeks of the season still in playoff position or at least, still in the mix, to get a spot. So I all too often I've sold them short, and it's kind of I've regretted it because they're there in the end. But again, are they there as legitimate contenders, a legitimate team that could win the Super Bowl? And as they're presently constructed, no, not until they get a long-term answer at quarterback. I think maybe they'd get a little bit juice out of Aaron Rodgers. I say a little bit, but over 17 games, do you expect him to be there, be healthy at the end, and to have an offense that, continues to grow and is getting better through the course of the seasons, peaking at the right time? That's hard to imagine with what we saw from Rodgers last year. The Bengals, I'm a little surprised in a way, because I think in some circles they're going to be viewed as off-season winners, just because I don't think anyone expected them to get the two deals and with the two receivers, and it certainly sounds like they're making a good effort to get Hendrickson back and to solve that issue. And obviously they re-signed the tight end, another guy that Joe Burrow wanted them to keep. So I think some people, but again, I mean, they could score on anybody last year. That wasn't the issue. They couldn't defend anybody. And they've lost a couple guys from that defense. And Mike Hilton's a guy that is available now, who I actually like for the Ravens, as a kind of Millette replacement, a veteran who's a very good blitzer in the slot, physical player, been around the division. I don't think you want him covering in certain matchups, but I think smart defenses use those pieces and find matchups. So they're losing a lot. They're losing some guys defensively until they get that figured out. Yeah, I think the Ravens are you have to give the Ravens the nod over them as the AFC North favorites as the teams are presently constructed. And I mean, Higgins hasn't been that healthy. He's missed some time the last 2 years. So they have some questions too offensively and with their offensive line. So yeah, I think as it's setting up, I don't think this has been it started a little rough, and obviously you have the Tucker thing swirling. But I think with a good draft and a couple smart free agent moves, I think the Ravens would kind of solidify themselves as the AFC North favorites heading into next year.
Jeff, great stuff as always. We enjoy each of your visits here on the front office. How can our listeners keep up with you on social media and any subscription deals right now these days going on at the Athletic?
You know what? I wish we do have a subscription deal, and I wish I had the specifics for you guys, but I would have to look it up, and I don't want to hold you up. So there's always deals going on at the Athletic, and we do so much for the draft. So it's going to be a really exciting time. I'll be in West Palm Beach at this time next week for the NFL owners meetings. There's a coaching breakfast next Monday where John Harbaugh is going to address the media for about a half hour, and it looks like a couple of, at least, maybe team president Sashi Brown will talk to the media. I know he did last year at this event. So I don't know. I'm not sure about owner Steve Bisciotti, but so I'll be there. So we'll have constant content up through the draft, and that's pretty much where you find me. I'm still on Twitter. I haven't made the blue, what is it, Blue Sky. I haven't made that jump yet. So you can find me in the usual places.
Jeff, as always, thanks again, and have a good rest of your evening.
Take care, guys. Always enjoy talking with you.
All right, see you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
Take care, Brian.
So, Brian, any other things we haven't touched on related to the salary cap, or any other transactions that our listeners should know about, or anything you think might be worthy as it relates to the front office?
No, I mean, I think it's as we kind of discussed, I think we're kind of going to be in a bit of a lull here until the draft. There might be a minor signing here or there. They have the cap space right now. I mean, obviously they can create cap space later. They don't really need to do it now. They don't need to have 30 million in cap space right now. And with the 11 they have, they can probably, any free agent out there, they can sign whoever they want. So yeah, I mean, the only other thing, the interesting thing is using all the void years, even on these minor deals. That's also leads me to believe that, and I think I said this a couple weeks ago, that that they were keeping Andrews based on that, and they weren't going to restructure Lamar unless they really, really have to, because they don't want to mess with those numbers. So all these void years are being used to lessen the impact this year and then go from there. But other than that, I mean, that's the surprising, because it's just some of the minor amounts on these void years don't seem like it's worth it, but obviously they know what they're looking at and what they're expecting that we can't anticipate.
Okay, well, I think that does it for episode 6 of 2025. Brian, as always, thank you for your time, and thank you, listeners, for chiming in or for listening. And we'll be back again next week here on the front office. Thanks again.